39a, and we were learning about the soup made from vegetables, that the bracha, even if a person does not eat the vegetables, but if made a soup from vegetables, the bracha would be the bracha that you would recite on the vegetable itself, even though you're not eating the vegetable, but you're eating the taste of that vegetable. Which sounds a little surprising. In other words, you're not actually having the vegetable. So for example, let's say you make a broccoli soup and you pull out the broccoli pieces after it gives flavor into the water. So you put a lot of broccoli and you cook it, and the soup now has a flavor of broccoli. Now you pull out the broccoli, the water would now be ho'adama water, bayre pri ho'adama, because you're actually tasting the flavor of the vegetable in the water. So even without eating the vegetable, the bracha would be ho'adama. And the example that it gives in the Gemara is maya de silka. It mentions the water of the water that beets are cooked in, water that turnips are cooked in, and then it says water that all vegetables are cooked in. The bracha is as if you're eating the actual vegetable. And
but what if you are eating, if you didn't take the vegetable out, if it's a soup?
Yeah, then you don't have to recite the bracha twice. You recite once that same bracha.
But still an adama?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't. Yes, Susan.
Okay, but if you add something that's one of a grain, if you add matzo balls that are
Okay,
made,
that's another story, right? We're not going to deal with that now.
Okay.
But that would be another story about either adding a bracha or changing the bracha because of some other. We're talking just simply the soup is made with these vegetables. So the Gemara now asks a question about what happens if you put dill into this dish. So you have a dish that you cooked, and the dish is really meant to be shahako. For whatever reason, it's the bracha on the dish that you're cooking is shahako, deserves a bracha shahako, but you're adding dill, but you're not going to eat the dill. You're putting it in either to give flavor or to take away some negative flavor that's there. And the question is, that the Gemara has is, why would you be putting this dill into this dish and then removing it? If it's for flavor, then the bracha would change from a shahako to a ho'adama, because dill is ho'adama, comes from the ground, and if it's just to remove the other flavor that's in the dish, so then you would not recite a bracha on the dill. It would still be shahako. You're just removing the negative flavor that was there from the dish, and you're removing it. So that's basically the discussion of the Gemara. I will mention that this is where you start getting the question of the bracha on coffee or tea, because you're cooking herbs, it would seem that the bracha on tea and maybe on coffee as well, this is similar to our Gemara. You're pouring hot water over dill or over some other vegetable, and you're getting the soup from it, and maybe the bracha should be a ha'adama or ha'etz, depending on what's in the tea bag. And this is an interesting question that the commentaries struggle to figure out. Why do we only recite a shahakol on coffee or tea? It is, according to this, there may be reason to say a ha'adama or a ha'etz on tea or coffee. Now, let me read this Gemara inside. So, Boy Rav Papa. Rav Papa asks, and we are holding on what line? We are holding 7, 8 lines up from the bottom of the page. Boy Rav Papa Maya de Shivsa Mai. The water that dill is placed in to give flavor, and then it's removed. What is the bracha on that dish? And the Gemara says, "Limatuke taima avdi." Is it put in to give flavor? Oila bure zuhama avdila, or is it to remove a zuhama, a bad flavor? Is that why it's placed in the dish? And this is the Gemara's question: would the dish stay shahakol, or would the dish be upgraded because of the dill that it's giving flavor to? Would the dish now be updated to that bracha, to the ha'adama? So the Gemara says, Tashema, come in here. We're going to bring a proof from the laws of Truma and the laws of Tuma. What does this mean? Well, what this means is that we're going to look in the Mishnah and we're going to find out if there's any source where it tells us the purpose of putting dill in a dish. And so this Mishnah seems to give us that clue. Hasheves mishanosna tam bekedera, the dill, once it gives a flavor into the dish, ein ba mishum truma. It doesn't have the laws and the prohibitions of truma. So, for example, truma is, in this week's parsha, actually, the word truma, but the meaning here, we're talking about truma is a gift that was given to the Kohen. It literally also means a donation. Truma is a donation, and the parsha truma refers to the donations they gave to the Beis Hamikdash to build a mishkan, to build a tabernacle. But in the Gemara, now that we're using the word learning, we're talking about truma. We're talking about the donation given to the Kohen, and the truma was 2%, 1/50th. It says people who were generous, they used to give 1/40th. People who were stingy, they would give 1/60th. But truma, the official, the Beinani, the regular person, would give 1/50th, so which means 2%. And the law of truma is that once the truma, you eat the truma, what's left afterwards that's inedible is no longer the holiness of truma. Truma had a certain holiness to it, and you had to be careful not to make it impure and doing things that are degrading with it. So the laws of truma applied as long as it had flavor in it. What happens if you put that dill in a dish and then you pulled out the dill and it's no longer has any flavor in it? You know, it's almost like using a tea bag a third time. You could use a tea bag twice, but the third time already, it's basically water. If you try, you know, that it doesn't really give off any flavor. There's no more flavor left. So here we're talking about dill. In dill, once it gives the flavor into the dish, it's not going to give much flavor anymore. And according to halacha, it loses its status, its holiness, its rules, its prohibitions of truma. And so the Mishnah could have said two things. It could have said, once the dill removes, it deodorizes the pot, it is no longer truma. Or it could say, once it gives a flavor to the pot, it's no longer truma. Once it gives flavor to the soup, it's no longer truma. So it could say one of those two options. And the one that it chose to say is once it gives flavor into the dish that's being cooked, it no longer is considered truma. It's no longer a vegetable, really. It's like a piece of wood now. It's basically there's no flavor in it left. So it's a weed, you know. It's a piece of it's a stalk. There's no flavor anymore. And so this is this is what the Mishnah says. Now, if someone asks you, so does dill give flavor? Do you use dill for flavor, or do you use dill to deodorize the dish? We see now in the Mishnah that it's used to give flavor. Because the Mishnah says once the dill gives flavor, it no longer has the laws of truma. Now, the Mishnah continues and it says about tumah, the laws of purity and impurity. And it says, let me read it inside. Toshima, come in here. Hasheves, the dill, that's truma dill, which has a certain holiness to it. Mishanos datam b'kedera, once it gives a flavor in the pot that you're cooking, once you stuck the dill in it and gave flavor off, ein ba, it no longer has mishum truma, the laws, the status of truma. And so, for example, let's say that dill fell into another pot and you wanted to serve it to your Israelite friends. So you're a Kohen, you're allowed to eat truma. So you made a nice dish with your truma dill. Now that dill, after you made your dish, it actually fell into a pot. You were cooking a soup for your guests because they can't have your truma soup. So you were making a soup for them. Now you took out the dill from your soup, and guess what happened? It fell out of the fork. It fell from the fork into the other pot before you got it into the garbage. It fell into the other pot. Now, does that other pot now become truma? Because you are holding truma dill, and now you won't be able to serve the soup that you cooked for your guests, your Israelite guests. You can't serve it to them because they are not Kohens, and maybe they can't eat it. On the other hand, it's reused, it's recycled dill. So maybe it doesn't give any more flavor. So on this, the Mishnah says that it's no longer truma. You would be allowed to serve your guests the soup that this dill fell into. The dill fell into this Israelite soup, and the dill is started out as truma dill, but because it was already used, it's now recycled dill. And let me mute everyone. And there's no longer a problem for an Israelite to eat that dill or to eat a soup that dill is in. It's not a problem at all because it's no longer truma. Yes, Ben?
Does it change the blessing if it's truma or not truma? Because we are dealing with blessings. We're not dealing with truma here.
Right. So what we're bringing from the Mishnah is nothing to do with the actual bracha. All what we're bringing is a practical side of dill. Is dill used for flavoring, or is it used to remove the bad odor that might be connected to a certain dish?
It happens to be a truma. issue also from that example.
The Mishnah happens to be talking about truma, but we only care about two words. Lematek, 3 words. Mishanosna tam b'kadeira. That's all we care about. That the Mishnah uses that time, that symbol, that sign, that measurement, that indicator, to tell us. We see from there that the purpose of the dill is for that purpose, to give flavor, and it's not used to deodorize the bad flavor in the pot. Now, I don't know a good example of this, but I guess there must be foods that are very strong and that you somehow want to remove flavor from them. And the Gemara, I guess, thinks that dill might be used for that. I don't know what that would be.
I think Steinsaltz calls it sweetening.
No, that's using it for flavor. What about the other side?
Right.
What's the other option? The other option is to deodorize the food. Maybe something that has like a negative
odor, or to sweeten. That's what he calls it.
To remove the odor, right? I'm trying to think of what would have like a bad odor that you would use dill to remove.
A rotten vegetable would have some.
Well, you wouldn't have a soup with a rotten vegetable in it.
Right,
You wouldn't serve it. You wouldn't want it.
If you missed it, it would give some odor to the soup.
And then you're gonna serve it.
Well, that's why they're sweetening it.
In any event, so we see here that the dill is used to give a flavor. Now, so there's no problem of truma, and it doesn't become tameh. If something touches it that's tameh, it does not become tameh anymore because it's not a food anymore. Once it's not considered a food, it's inedible. It no longer has the problem. It doesn't become tameh. It's no longer susceptible to becoming tameh, a food tumah. Now, shma mina lematuke taima abdillah. So the Gemara says we see from here that it's lematuke taima. It is used for giving flavor, and if so, the bracha on the dish would be changed into a ho'adama. It would be changed into ho'adama, and the reason is because it's basically considered like a dill soup, I guess. It now is like a dish that's dill flavored, and as we saw before, beet soup and other soups would be ho'adama. Here also, this is now considered like a ho'adama. Yes, Susan.
Okay, the dill is used to clean up the foam from any kind of meat or chicken. When you make any kind of soup, that foam that comes to the top has to grab on something, and that's why we use dill. And then we throw it. Yes.
Okay. I always thought it was for the flavor, but I guess that's the difference with the Gemara's thoughts. One thought is maybe Susan, maybe Rabbi Smith.
Depending on how much.
That was the Gemara's question.
And also that dill that I throw out, I will add fresh dill later on.
For the flavoring.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting.
You can take the foam out without the dill too.
Who cares about the foam? That's my question. Why can't you just eat the soup with the foam?
That's the unclean part of the soup.
Thank you, Ben. Exactly.
Okay. All right. Well, that is the Gemara's conclusion that it's meant for flavoring. Now, what you're saying is that the initial dill is really used for the purpose of removing the zuama, which maybe means that foam. But it seems like at least in the time of the Gemara then that they used it for both, and it also was meant to give flavor. And maybe that's why the Gemara's conclusion, maybe the Gemara's thought was maybe what's the main purpose of it? And the Gemara's conclusion is the main purpose is the giving flavor. And but that is interesting. That's why people use it to what it absorbs. Is that why it takes up the?
No, it
No,
doesn't.
it just sticks to it.
Right, exactly.
Okay, nice. We'll become chefs after we finish learning this tractate. Or this
Kosher
chapter.
chef. Kosher
When we
chef.
finish, when we finish this chapter. Okay, the next Gemara is going to talk about the law of bread pieces in a soup, but we're not really talking about the bracha on it. We're more talking about what would be the proper bread to recite the bracha on. Are there breads that are more preferred to recite the bracha on, and breads that are less preferred to recite the bracha on? And this is what the Gemara is going to deal with. And then the Gemara gets into the issue of, is it appropriate to slice the bread before you conclude the blessing or only after you conclude the blessing? This is also interconnected. So let's learn the next piece of Gemara. Amar Reb Chia bar Ashi. Reb Chia bar Ashi said, Pas tsunuma, if you have bread that is dry, and so you're going to be putting it in the soup, and you're putting it baka'ara, inside a soup in order to soften it, and ultimately it's going to dissolve a little, but there still will be pieces big enough to cause it to be hamaitzi. So we're not really questioning the hamaitzi blessing here. We've dealt with that earlier on in this chapter, and we've come to we came to two different views. If once it's the size of an olive, that gives it makes it considered a hamaitzi. Another option was that it's if you hold on to it and it breaks apart, that would be a problem. But if it stays intact, then it's hamaitzi. But that was a previous Gemara. Here we're not dealing. We're talking about a case where it is the bracha is hamaitzi, but the issue is that you're going to recite a hamaitzi on this bread versus another bread versus waiting to recite. Maybe you should have recited hamaitzi before you dissolve it, before you soften it, and it's complete. In other words, here you have two options. One option would be to recite the bracha on a complete bread and then put it into your soup, or you put it into your soup and then recite the hamaitzi. Another option is recite the hamaitzi on another bread, or should you recite the hamaitzi on this bread that is broken into some pieces and it is put into the soup? So which one should you recite? When should you recite the hamaitzi? So here, Rav Chia bar Ashi says, Pas tsunuma baka'ara, this bread that's hard, that's soaked now in a ka'ara, in a bowl, mevarchen aleha hamaitzi, you recite on it hamaitzi. You can recite the hamaitzi on this. You don't have to recite it on a different bread or on a whole bread. You can recite it even on this bread that is not fully intact, either because you broke it into pieces, like crouton pieces or it dissolved on its own into some pieces, but you can recite the hamaitzi on this. Upliga de Reb Chia, and this argues with Reb Chia. And what does Reb Chia say? That the Amar Reb Chia tzarich shetichle habracha im hapas. Reb Chia says that you're supposed to recite a hamoitzi bracha on a complete loaf of bread, and after you recite, at the end of reciting the bracha, at the end of the recital of the bracha, you should be cutting the bread, and you finish the bracha, the recital of the bracha, while you finish slicing the first piece of bread. And in this way, you're able to eat the bread right after you finish the bracha. But you're supposed to recite the bracha on a whole loaf. But at the end of your recital of the bracha, you cut the piece off. So you recite a bracha on a complete loaf, and you then finish the bracha while finishing slicing that first piece of bread, and then you eat that bread. So according to Reb Chia, there's two people here that have similar names. There's Reb Chia bar Ashi, and there's Rebbe Chia. There's Rav Chia bar Ashi and Rebbe Chia. These two names, both Chias, either Rav Chia or Rebbe Chia, both of them are discussing reciting a bracha on bread, and one of them says you could recite it preferably on this broken up bread, and the other one says no, you should recite it on a complete loaf, but at the end of the bracha you finish, you slice off a piece. So this is an argument. Should you really wait and recite? Should you wait before cutting it, before dissolving the bread? Recite the hamoitzi on a whole loaf, or can you just cut it up and recite the hamoitzi on pieces? Now, the Gemara now asks a question. Rava asks a question on Reb Chia's thought of finishing the bracha while slicing the piece off. So, Maskif la Rava asks a question on Rebbe Chia. Maishna Tznuma, why is Tznuma bad? Why would you disagree that the Tznuma, the pieces of bread, that you shouldn't recite the hamoitzi on, Deloy, that you shouldn't recite the hamoitzi on, Mishum dechikalya bracha, because when you finish the bracha, prusa kokalya, you're finishing the bracha on a piece. If you don't like doing that, Reb Chia, so why do you hold that you should say the bracha and slice the bread while saying the bracha? You're also reciting a bracha. The end of the bracha ends up being recited on a piece, and the whole bread is not there. The whole bread is not there when you finish the bracha. So this is a little question that, you're trying to be so strict, Rava says. You're trying to be so careful to recite a bracha on something whole. And what are you doing? You're slicing it right at the end. You ruin it, because right at the end of your bracha, you're slicing off a piece. It's not whole. You ruin it in the last moment. So Rava says, no, don't do that. He says, you say the bracha on the whole thing, and then you slice it. Don't start slicing it before you finish the bracha. You ruin the whole. So the wording of Rava is just like the tsnuma you don't want to do, because the tsnuma is the pieces, and it's not whole. You're saying the bracha, you're finishing the bracha on something that's not whole. Al apas nami, the bread also, kika gamra, aprusa gamra. When you're finishing the bracha, you're finishing it on a bread that's not complete, it's not whole, and therefore the proper way to do it is going to be as he explains now on page B. So we got to turn 39B now. We're turning to 39B.
I have a question, Rabbi.
Yeah, what's your question? Yes, Ben.
The question is, what if you don't have a whole bread? You have a couple pieces of dry bread and you want to put it in the soup?
There's no problem. Here we're talking about where you have that option.
Right. So
right. If you don't have the option, of course, you recite Hamaitzi. The question is, what's the preferable way to do it? The preferred way to do things.
If you still have a whole dry bread, you can talk about it.
But you?
If you don't?
But should you recite the bracha on the whole bread? Or do you not need to?
Yeah. So
that's
if you put just croutons in, you can't.
Well, I don't want to use the word croutons because croutons could be questionable if they're mezainis or hamaitzi. There is discussion about
it's homemade croutons. You can cut up your bread and have fun with croutons.
Right. Well, homemade croutons, yeah, might be a much different rule. Yes, Robert.
Now, I have a more basic interpretation than Ben does, and it is that you've got a whole loaf of bread, and you need to make the bracha on the whole loaf of bread, because if you're going to slice it in how many pieces, then you have to make a bracha on any one of those pieces that you use going forward. So for me, it's a simplicity of having it, but it doesn't matter if you have one piece or you have a loaf, because what you have in essence is the bread in your possession. And sometimes I believe that's the same thing with vegetables. If you slice up vegetables and you eat them one at a time, or you throw them in the pot to boil, then again, you're using essentially the whole of the object. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure what you're saying, Robert. Either way, you're not going to recite more than one hamaitzi. If you slice it up or you keep it whole,
okay, all right,
there's only going to be one bracha.
But if you use the bread at a later date, a slice of the bread, okay,
yeah, either way, you
still have to make the motzi every time you put the bread in your mouth and every successive meal, right?
And the same thing would apply even if it was whole later on. If you have a whole loaf and you recited the bracha on it when it's whole, and then 3 days later or a day later or a half hour or an hour or 2 hours later, you decide to have another sandwich, you would say another hamaitzi. If it's a different meal, you would say another hamaitzi, even if it was whole. So either way, you're not saving time by cutting it up or not cutting it up. So what it boils down to is the preferred way to recite a bracha. Now, if I'm not mistaken, this whole idea of preferred is about giving away the best to Hashem. This is my thought. I have to see if it flows, if it's...
because it's in its entirety, therefore it's in devotion and thank you to God because of it being in its entirety as a created object.
It's a more complete gift.
Yeah, okay.
It's a more honorable gift to Hashem. On the other hand, there is another way of looking at it, and that is that a person should give what they like most to Hashem. And then if you follow that way of thinking, so it's more subjective versus objective. And you like the broken pieces in your soup better than a whole loaf, maybe. And so in your situation, this is what you're considering better, and therefore you should maybe recite the bracha on this. So it's more honorable. So there's two ways of looking at it. On the one hand, the loaf looks better as a more honorable gift for Hashem. You're reciting a bracha on a nice loaf. On the other hand, you could recite a bracha on what you cherish most.
But you're not losing either way. You're still giving the bracha to Hashem because you got it in its entirety, and then you get your bread and you can eat it too.
Right. You're for sure eating the bread. You're saying the same bracha.
Right. It's just a matter of Right, it's grace. It's giving grace. It's another interpretation. Yeah, it's
what's a better way to give grace? At least that's the way I see what's going on. Now, in addition to that, there is this other element here, and that is that when is the main part of the bracha that we care about, that your loaf should be whole. Let's say you want to follow the understanding that it should be whole. Does it go by the last words of the bracha? Is that the most important, or the entire bracha should be recited when it's whole? Or is it enough to say Hashem's name when it's whole, and then you could start slicing it? Or as long as you or the majority, maybe the majority of the bracha is said on a whole loaf, and at the end of the bracha you finished, and you can then finish slicing it and eat it without more of an interruption. So that is the second discussion that we're seeing here between Rava and Rabbi Chia. So we've got these discussions of priority and preference of the bread, either pas senuma or this shuling, or a complete bread. Now, there is also a concept of, which we'll soon see, of a large piece versus a small piece. Is it more? In other words, it could be that complete isn't as important or doesn't really play a role, but largeness does. Something bigger is more honorable to give a blessing to Hashem than something smaller. So it goes by size versus by completion. That we'll soon see. But here we have this discussion, and we've just finished this discussion of Rava, Reb Chia, and Reb Chia bar Ashi. And now the Gemara says that different rabbis followed, which rabbis followed who. So let's see. The Gemara says Neherdai, the people of Neherdai, or the yeshiva in Neherdai, they did ki Rabbi Chia, they followed Rabbi Chia, who said that you you cut the loaf of bread at the end of the bracha. You're cutting the loaf, you're cutting the piece, and because of that, he says that's the way to do it. You should recite the bracha on a whole loaf, but you cut it at the end of your bracha. And so the Neherdai people, they followed Rabbi Chia. V'Rabbanan Avdi Kirava. And the rabbis, they followed the other view, Rava, which said that you first recite Hamaitzi and then you slice it. Now, Ravina was an orphan, and Ravina's father passed away when he was young, and therefore Ravina says, Amar Ravina, Amra li'ei, my mother told me, Avoch Avid ki Rabbi Chia, your father did like Rabbi Chia. That's what Ravina said, that his mother told him how his father would do it. He followed Rabbi Chia, that they would slice the bread at the end of the bracha. While they were finishing the bracha, they would slice the bread, and not like Rava. The Amar Rabbi Chia, Tzarech shetichla bracha im hapas. You have to finish the bracha with the slicing of the bread. Rabbanan Avdi Karava, but the rabbis did like Rava. So we have different views here, and the Gemara now concludes and says v'hilchasa, and the halacha is kerava, like Rava. The Amar mevarech b'yachakach b'tzeya, who says that you should recite the bracha on a complete loaf, and afterwards you slice the loaf, and that is preferable. Why is it preferable? Because your whole bracha is on the complete loaf. Now, Tosfos over here tells us, in the top right Tosfos over here, he says that the halacha follows Rava, and that means that you should not separate a piece from the bread until after you finish the bracha. Now, he says some have a custom not to even start slicing it until you finish the bracha, but that's not what it means. That's not the proper minhag, he says. Because what's going to end up happening is you recite the entire bracha, and then you're going to have a moment of wasted time, an interruption. When you finish the bracha, you're going to start figuring out where to slice. So Tosfos says that's not appropriate. That's called hesech hadas. You're interrupting between the bracha and the food. And therefore, you should really make a slice in the bread, but don't complete the slice until after you finish the bracha. But if you make a slice in the bread first, you'll know exactly where to cut. So you finish the bracha, you're all set. You cut right away. Otherwise, you're going to hesitate till you decide where to cut the bread. Now, Tosfos then says, however, on Shabbos, it's proper to be careful and machmir. You should be more strict and recite the bracha completely before you even make a slice, because what happens if you slice too much and you'll end up cutting through, and there won't be a complete bread, and you need lechem mishnah, you need 2 breads for Shabbos. So he says on Shabbos, better don't make a cut, because if you cut, you might not have lechem mishnah. So better don't make a cut. After you finish the whole bread, then you can make a cut, and then you'll have a slight interruption, but it's better than not having lechem mishnah. Now, the commentaries tell us that even on Shabbos, you're not going to make a cut in the bread, but you could make a little mark, and that seems to be the custom. People make a little mark in the bread and where they're going to cut. And this way, after the bracha, they don't have an interruption because they have made a little mark in the bread where they're going to cut from, and it's no problem. Now, I guess the reason why Tosfos doesn't give that option is possibly because maybe their breads were very thin, could have broke even a little, or somehow they weren't as strong. Maybe they didn't have the same, maybe they didn't, with our ovens and the could be that things cook differently, and not sure, but the idea is that if you were to make a slice through the bread, and if that other piece is partially falling off, it's already problematic, because if you can't hold the entire loaf from the slice, then it means that it's as if it's cut off and it's not a complete loaf. And that would be a problem for lechem mishnah, for having double loaf on Shabbos, and so on. So it comes out that it's preferable to have this whole loaf, and the way to slice the bread at least on Shabbos, is to make a little mark on it. But if you do cut through, it could be questionable if you cut too much, if that's considered a complete bread to recite the hamaitzi and use to be used for lechem mishnah. That's what it would be a problem for. Is lechem mishnah to have a double, supposed to have two breads, two chalos, and you might not have it. So that is the end of this little piece of Gemara. Any questions? Okay, so let's go a little further. Itmar, we learned, it was said in the Beis Medrash, Heviu lifneyan pesisen. They brought before them breads, pieces, pesisen are pieces of bread, ushleimen, and complete bread. So they brought before them pieces of bread that's not complete, ushleimen, and complete bread. Now, which one should they recite the bracha on? Amar Rav Huna says, Mevarech al hapsisin upaiter es hashleim. You recite the bracha on the pieces, and you have in mind to exempt the other breads, the complete ones. Now, this sounds a little surprising. Why would you want to recite the bracha on the pieces and not on the complete one? And the answer is that according to Rav Huna, complete does not really matter. It matters which one is more, which one is larger. That's what really plays a role. It's almost like a child, you could give him, well, I guess not all children, but if you give a nice sized piece of cake, but it doesn't, it's not a full entity because it's a slice. You've cut off the edges, or you could have a Danish, but the piece is bigger. Maybe if you have a bigger piece of cake or a full Danish, the Danish is complete. A piece of cake is not really complete. Which one is better? You care about what's bigger. You don't care about if it's complete. So it could be that Rav Huna doesn't really see completion as being so significant as much as large does. Something that's larger, that would play a role. And this would mean that if the piece is larger than the complete loaf, then you would recite the bracha on the piece of bread versus the complete loaf. You know where you have this when they have those huge challahs for weddings. And so they could slice you a piece, that piece that they slice from those huge challahs. They have these challahs that are like, five challahs in it. It's huge. They do them for like Sheva Brochos or for weddings. So the slice, you can have a slice that's bigger than a roll. So which one should you recite the hamaitzi on? Should you recite the hamaitzi on the slice, which is bigger? So Rav Huna would say you would recite it on the psisin, on the piece, and you would exempt the large one and the complete one. Excuse me. Now Rabbi Yochanan says Shleima mitzvah min hamuvchar. The complete one is the mitzvah min hamuvchar, is the preferable bracha to recite on the complete one, because completion is something that's an honor. That's a more respectful thing than a slice. So it comes out that there's an argument between Rabbi Yochanan and Rav Huna. What is it better large, or is it better shalom, complete? That's what we see over here. Now, what happens if they're both the same size, according to Rav Huna? Which one would you recite the bracha? Again, Rabbi Yochanan says you always recite it on the complete one. Rav Huna says you recite it on the piece. But his idea, the point that he makes, that his opinion is that it goes by how big it is. So what happens if they're both the same size? You have a slice and a complete one, and they're both equal in size. Which one would Rav Huna say to recite the bracha? So the answer is whichever one is more chaviv, which one you desire more. Rav Huna says it goes by what one you want. Which one would you rather? Would you rather? Sometimes it's a different bakery. The large piece is from one bakery, and the roll is from a different bakery. You might like the large one. You might like it was less baked. The other one was too baked, was overbaked. Whatever it is, it goes by your preference. That's what Rav Huna would say. It's whichever one you want. Now, the Gemara then says, what about if one is made from wheat and the other one is made from barley? So we're learning the laws here of preference among brachas and preference among foods, I should say, and which foods is more preferable to recite the bracha on and have in mind the others. Which one should be the bracha recital is on the better food, something more honorable to recite the bracha. So the Gemara now continues, and it says that wheat is going to be better than barley. And how does that fit in with complete? If one of them is complete, let's say the barley's complete, but the wheat bread is a slice. So which one takes preference? So the Gemara says, Aval prusa shalchitin. What happens if you have a slice that's wheat, ushlema minasairin, and you have a complete challah from barley? So normally, the bracha would be on the wheat, and because wheat is considered better than barley, but here the question is, the barley is a complete. It's complete because it's a loaf. It's a complete loaf on its own, and the wheat bread is only a slice. So the Gemara says that even Rabbi Yochanan, who says we give priority to something complete, that's only if they're from the same species, they're the same type of flour. But aval prusa shalchitin shlema menasa oirin. So in this case, you have a slice of wheat bread, but a complete challah, that's barley. Divrei hakoil, everyone holds mevarech ala prusa shalchitin. You recite the bracha on the wheat, upaiter es hashlema menasa oirin, and you would exempt the complete challah from se'oirim, from barley. So even though this is only a slice, but it takes precedence over barley. And the reason for this is because the verse that talks about the species that Israel is blessed with, it says Eretz Chita Usaira, a land blessed with wheat and barley. Which one is first? It says wheat. So because it says wheat first, so therefore wheat comes before barley. Now, one of the questions that we're going to have to deal with is also what happens if one is a higher quality than the other. Let's say you have two wheats and one is a better quality than the other wheat. That's going to be, or for example, what happens if one is a whole wheat and the other one is only a refined white wheat? Which one would take precedence, and so on. We're going to discuss these laws. Okay, is there any questions here? Any thoughts? Yes, Susan.
Where is oats on the scale? Is that number 3?
Well, the problem is that the verse that tells us the 7 species, it only tells us wheat and barley. And then it goes to 5 fruits. So altogether 7. There's 2 grains and 5 fruits.
Okay.
However, the Talmud says that wheat and spelt is a type of wheat, and oats, rye, and oats and rye are a type of barley.
Okay. Okay.
So oats would go under the category of barley, and spelt would go under the category of wheat.
Well, we learned something new, don't we, huh?
So the idea behind all of this is obviously we want to give the greatest blessing. The most honorable will choose the most honorable thing to recite the bracha for Hashem. And the Gemara is clarifying what, how does that work? And it is complicated. I will tell you this, that in the olden days, the rabbis, when they wanted to take a son-in-law, the big rabbis, they would put in front of them a lot of foods and see which one they recited the bracha on. And they would test them. And based on that, they would decide if they want that guy to be their son-in-law.
So it was a food test by a different reason.
That's right.
Interesting.
So, in fact, there is a story about Rabbi Akiva Eger, who he did this test, and the future son-in-law, potential future son-in-law, took an egg to recite a shahakal on. And so the father-in-law, the future potential father-in-law, Rabbi Akiva Eger, asked him, "Why did you pick an egg?" So he made a joke, and he said, there is a verse that says, "V'ha'ai mikedem." I in Yiddish, and ayra means an egg. So there's a verse that says, the city of Ai is to the east. But he made a joke about the Yiddish meaning, that if you take that word and you use it as if it's a Yiddish word, it would mean the egg comes first. So he joked around. Rabbi Akiva Eger said, "This is not for me." He said, he broke it off. He says he makes a joke out of the Torah. So he lost his shidduch. He could have married the daughter of Rabbi Akiva Eger, but he lost it. So you got to be careful when they put a table in front of you, and you never know if they're testing you.
Be cautious of potential father-in-laws. That's it.
Right. Right.
Great.
Okay,
Thank
everyone,
you.
have a great day. We'll